overlap. So something that I have done throughout this presentation is try to highlight some of those different terminologies, as well as giving definitions and putting into context of when I'm talking to clients or working with people and saying like, hey, this is the big piece that I want to take away here. Here's how we can connect this in this way. I will, like I said earlier, with the nerding out process, I will introduce some ideas related to existentialism and end-of-life care, as well as modern bereavement-based theories. I have a lot of resources. Please pardon my reference page at the end, as the formatting within PowerPoint completely disheveled that whole process. I'm more than happy to coordinate with Burke and send you any of those things related to the reference list, as well as to the resources, because I do not believe those translate themselves appropriately. And that is completely my bad. What I would also like to highlight is different, again, interventions that you can take within the therapeutic setting, within working with families or people that you're connected to, or even for yourselves as well. And also being able, really key piece here, to be able to identify what are some of those risk factors related to substance or alcohol misuse that we may start to see in the holidays, that may ramp up during the holidays, or just ways that we can look to address some of those concerns with clients within the therapeutic setting, with family members, with friends, with ourselves, or any other capacity that you're thinking about, that we can talk more in depth as well. And I encourage that feedback as we're going through this if you have more specific questions. Just to give you an overview of the presentation, I'd like to start by going through, again, some of those different bereavement terminologies, grief terminologies, really looking at when do we start to maybe worry more so when we're looking at signs of uncomplicated grief, complicated grief, and what we'd always go on to say is also disenfranchised grief. We'll go into, again, some of that nerding out related to the bereavement theory of existentialism and meaning making, talking through those different interventions, and as well as preventative care measures. And I'm a big advocate of what I share with my clients as measures and ways that may help them. I too do my best to implement and practice those things as well. This is by no means a way of implying that this is a one size fits all, or what works for somebody may not work for somebody else. So also honoring the fact that grief is such a, while it is a universal experience that we all may have in some capacity, our own individual experiences are so unique and important and deserve to have that space, that validation, and that time to be able to heal. So I just want to give that as a caveat just up front. This is not a prescription or one size fits all kind of situation, which is also why I've made an effort to put in so many different variations related to talking about grief and the different terminology used, talking about the different bereavement theories, and really encourage you to think about what makes sense perhaps for you as an individual, for you if you are a practicing clinician, for you if you are working in a support role in any whatever capacity that may be. We're also going to go into a discussion. I will also be including some examples of some case examples that I've done as an art therapist in working specifically with children who've experienced traumatic grief, complicated grief, disenfranchised grief, as well as end-of-life care. So that is the overview in a nutshell. So to start, we will go through, again, defining grief through the lens of the DSM-5 and the text revision. We will look at some of those different variations between complicated grief, traumatic grief, and disenfranchised grief. And if those are terms that you are not familiar with, that's no problem at all. Oftentimes what we see is what we have listed in perhaps like day-to-day resources that we hand out to clients. We use different terminology than we do in research, and that may even look different than what the medical field uses in the DSM. So just to give you an idea, because a common question that comes to mind is, how do I know if I'm grieving the correct way? And something I, really emphasize to people, and particularly too around the holidays, I'm going to do my best to weave this in throughout and not bombard you with information in the PowerPoint slides, is how do I know that I'm doing it right? Well, we know that there's no true hard, fast way that you're supposed to grieve. There's no timeline. As we said before, each of our experiences are unique to us as individuals, as well as to the relationship with the person or people that are no longer physically present with us. It is not uncommon at all for clients to be and I use the word confused in that intellectually we may understand why something's happening, existing, but emotionally there may be just a complete disconnect. I can't tell you how many people I've worked with over the past decade and a half who've been experiencing grief and are just truly unsure what it means of, oh, I've seen it on TV shows or I've seen it highlighted in this way. I just didn't know that that's what it felt like. I also didn't know it was going to last this long. And the big thing I say to clients too is that I wish I had a crystal ball or something that could say like, hey, this is when the grief is going to stop hurting, or this is when it'll stop feeling that kind of way. But one, we may not know that because grief in many ways is an extension of the love that we had for that person or those people. And for that to just magically go away, that certainly takes away from the love and connection that was built over the time spent with that person. So just again, trying to give that sort of just reflection back to clients and also even to ourselves sometimes as we are experiencing our grief resurfacing or what it used to look like or what it may look like now. So all to say some common things that may be helpful to remind yourselves, again, even though if intellectually we understand this, but reminding ourselves emotionally with that compassion, with that support, that can include some bodily distress. Are we suddenly having a complete loss of appetite? Is sleeping just not happening? Are we waking up at those weird hours in the middle of the night and just not able to focus, not able to go back to sleep? Can't actually go downstairs and get that extra load of laundry done, but just laying there aimlessly. Other times I've had clients describe, sleeping excessively. No matter how much amount of sleep I get, if I take sleep aids or what have you, nothing seems to be helping, which also ties back to that substance misuse too. There may be preoccupation with the deceased. So whether that's looking at certain photos or memorabilia that you may have around the house, maybe that's remembering spaces or locations that you used to go to together, restaurants, parks, where you went on that first date, and anything like that. You may notice two people experiencing having hostile reactions, increased road rage, shorter frustration tolerances, being mad that that coupon did not work, even though the expiration date says it clearly does. So having these heightened reactions to things that it wouldn't normally necessarily bother us in such a way. The DSM also talks about as well, almost this notion of like an inability to function the way one has had in the past. I really like to consider all of the symptomatology on a spectrum. So we really start to think about like, okay, if someone that we love just died in the past 2 months, it would be completely reasonable for someone to be struggling to focus, to remember, to complete certain tasks at work, remembering if they went to the grocery store or not, still being able to go through the motions of the day-to-day, but we're having lapses in memory or judgment or things that are happening. I want to again preface this with I look at this on a spectrum in that being mindful of this sort of timeline that's associated with when are we supposed to be done grieving. I grew up in a Catholic household, so the running, I wouldn't say the running joke because that also sounds loaded, but perhaps our way of thinking about grief when we were growing up was you had 3 days to grieve and then everything went back in a box and neatly placed in a box until the next year when that day came up. And while I say that tongue in cheek, it also really made me revisit how, whether as a religion, as a spirituality, as a culture, what does that look like for ourselves as well as for our community or the people that we are connected to? And how are we giving ourselves permission or the lack thereof to actually process that grief? So we'll hold that right here. The addendum to that too is then we start thinking about the holidays, where all of a sudden there's these expectations, these thoughts about what we should be doing, what family looks like, that can add substantial stress and pressure on us as the individual who is mourning of what that is supposed to look like. So when I look at the list from the uncomplicated bereavement signs to what the DSM-5 calls prolonged grief disorder, which truly is just an extension of experiencing grief-related symptoms for longer periods of time, but also more intensely throughout. So that may present itself as this complete avoidance of acknowledging the death, talking about the person who has died, addressing anything maybe related to estate planning or things that may need to be done or put into place, and maybe emotionally cutting themselves off from present family members, from work, from social support networks. It may perpetuate intense feelings of loneliness. In other aspects, or what I argue on the other end of the spectrum, sometimes it can perpetuate this feelings of intense pain, of anger, bitterness, regret, sorrow, sadness. Also for many clients, and I'm sure for many of you as well, it changes depending on the day, depending on the time of day, depending on the moment where I am. That can all look very different. And I want to clarify too, in relation to my example earlier with the growing up Catholic and having the 3 days to grieve. I also consider that too when we start to look at what it means in terms of timeline and our own expectations for how we are grieving, what that should look like. I think we also have to consider when we think about what are those ways that we're able to express that grief? What does that look like? That becomes another imperative piece in how that directly ties into potential for substance misuse or temptation to want to avoid some of those feelings, avoid talking about it. And for those of us as well who have experienced loss, having not been given the tools to be able to understand how to process that can also be deeply troubling and concerning as well. So when we go further on to, and again, as the DSM-5 talks about this prolonged grief disorder, and complicated grief, we're essentially comparing, we're looking at more or less the same thing. We're looking at the fact that symptoms related to grief are further intensified, both in length and intensity of the emotion. If there are further questions related to adults who may be grieving versus children or adolescents, I'm happy to address those more specifically towards the end. I'm trying to give you all more of an overview, if you will, and not get stuck too much in the nitty-gritty details. What complicated grief, again, just more examples for you to be able to put in context. This may create further intensified distress. So whether that is related to increased anxiety, maybe that is, I have suffered the loss of my partner. Now I have an intense fear of being separated from my children, from my animals, from my extended family, from my siblings. That can perpetuate challenges with being able to function and going to work. Is it okay sending my kids to school? Is it okay for somebody else to get in a car with my kids or take care of them? I may be preoccupied with ideas about my partner who has passed, experiencing intense stress levels, like replaying the memory of what happened before they died, when they died, or after they died, having a shattered sense of safety. What does this mean with this new space that I'm trying to exist within? Relating to my priorities, my responsibilities, my accountability. That can, again, thinking of that spectrum, can go on one end of detachment, isolation, anger, disbelief, wanting almost a numbing out, or another, the end of the spectrum, almost being in a state of paralysis, like stuck in that moment and unable to pull myself out and return to the present moment. There's the example given here as well as it relates to traumatic bereavement. As I said earlier, despite the fact that we may have, as human beings, the universal experience of losing someone we love because of their life has ended, how they die can play a tremendous role in our ability to cope and to process, which again, intellectually, many of us can understand. Well, yeah, if somebody dies suddenly in a car accident, that may look very different than someone who's in hospice and end of life care. And I know I can anticipate or have maybe more of an idea than this sudden loss. But truthfully, both of those, one is not better than the other. They are simply different, and they come with different extremes related to the depth of our grief-related symptoms, as well as the time spent that we are grieving. Particularly with traumatic bereavement, this is highlighting the shift of when somebody dies in a traumatic fashion and it occurs unexpectedly. Again, examples of this could include, but are certainly not limited to, and I want to preface this with a trigger warning because my intention is not to trigger anyone, but simply to give you the information that's relayed through the research. So traumatic deaths may include dying by completing suicide, again, traumatic car accidents, homicide, drowning. And those are just some various examples that come into play. What becomes really essential in looking at these different categories of grief, I think about it almost as like a big umbrella. And in addition to experiencing not just the loss itself of losing someone we love, there's also this other component that we call disenfranchised grief. And this is when we look at the ways in which someone has in our life has died that are not considered socially acceptable or socially sanctioned, where they tend to be negated by society at large or through I'm thinking about through social, whether that is through religion, through cultural norms, through social norms, and it can perpetuate for the person mourning. It may perpetuate intense feelings of shame, of guilt, of a need to modify how someone has died, or modify the story, or feel a need to be protective, not only of yourself as the mourner, but for others around you. That fear of, oh, if they really knew, would they feel differently? This can make grieving even more complicated in that there's this other added layer that we have almost in many ways exiled or put, I like to refer to as like putting things in boxes and shoving in the storage unit. We're not ready to look at it. We're just going to leave it there. We know how it has to be addressed at some point. Problem with that is that how often those boxes don't get unpacked, how often they sit there, they collect dust, they collect mold. I'm not trying to give anyone anxiety related to to storage units, but I use these all as a metaphor to describe the ways in which that these are almost thinking about it as like seeds being planted for the potential for substance misuse as it relates to the holidays. I'll get back to that in a minute. And again, when these symptoms are not addressed, it can perpetuate complicated grief and certainly other mental health related symptoms as well. So as a therapist, it's going to be imperative that when we are talking to a client that has experienced grief, for us to be intentional about the questions that we are asking, holding space for the person to process that, and also have an understanding too that as the clinician, we may not be getting all of this information, certainly not all at once, and it may take time for our client or clients to begin opening up to the depth and intensity of their experience of their loss and their reprocessing of the loss, because it doesn't just happen in 3 days. As I said before, we innately have a universal experience of loving other people and experiencing grief through the loss of those people. But what we also know too is that grief doesn't exist in a vacuum. And what I mean by that is that grief does not fit in a cookie cutter box of like, this is the steps of how you grieve. It goes in this linear process. There's, I think the one thing that is certainly true for grief as it relates to everybody is it's a universal feeling and there's nothing linear about it at all. So, and by that, I mean that when we lose a loved one, there are so many other circumstances that also come into play as it relates to that loss that is tied to our home life, our family, our work, our job, our social connections, our financial stability, our capacity to take care of ourselves. And that is just assuming that we have just lost one person. But when those losses compound, or we maybe perhaps are part of the sandwich generation, we are caring for both our parents as well for small children, or if we are what I lovingly call tiny humans, people under 18, that also change the trajectory of how we see and view our world, our sense of safety and connection, who's taking care of us, and what does that mean? All this to say that I think that's another very important piece to reiterate to clients too when they're experiencing grief, and that notion of, I should be over this. Why does this still bother me? This doesn't make sense. Your grief doesn't exist in a vacuum. when we look at addressing this with clients within the therapeutic setting, it is essential for us to begin to understand, and as therapists, listening. And I say that, and I know it sounds like such a simple thing, but the gift of listening to someone else as they share about someone they love so deeply, so wholeheartedly, that they have come and sought out mental health services because the loss of that person no longer physically being present in their life is that, sorry, is that painful. These are those moments as clinicians. It is not important for us to tell them whether the 5 stages of grief is real or related to actual grieving as opposed to end of life care. This is not important for us to say, hey, here's, let me spell out for you what you may be experiencing. As a therapist, I would do my best to start to sit back and to listen, because the gift of learning about someone else's relationship with someone they love, that is an honor. And the client is also someone who is aware of their own experiences and deserves that space and time to be able to hear that. I also want to bring into play here too, bringing awareness to, and again, as individuals, we cannot possibly be an expert in every culture, every religion, every form of ritual as it relates to grief. But what we can do is we can certainly be curious. We can ask thoughtful, intentional questions. And so I offer that both as I'm giving this presentation, when I go into more modern grief-related theory and existentialism, and to just be mindful of what are our own biases that we may bring to the therapeutic relationship when we're giving presentations and talking about this, or talking to communities or connections to other people, that's important as well to consider. I see that there's a lot of things going on in the chat, so I'm just going to take a peek at this really quickly. Kathy, I sincerely appreciate you sharing, and I'm so glad that you are here today. Michelle, I want to extend that same gratitude for you being here today and also for sharing. I'm hopeful that we will be able to, if you are open to sharing or wanting to talk about that further in our discussion section, I would love to be able to create that space for you all as well. And Lauren, thank you for the grief experience visual. I think that is spot on. So as it relates to some of the bereavement theory, we're looking at what I've provided today is looking at through the lens of existentialism through Martin Heidegger, who's a really old guy who wrote a lot of stuff in German that doesn't translate well into English. But I really want to point just at a small piece of his theory that looks at what it means to live and exist authentically in our life as we are existing in the world, when we are enduring the grief and loss of someone that we love, and what it means to be able to exist authentically following that. This ties in with meaning making and creating and reconstructing our sense of self and our sense of being with Robert Niemeyer and Thomas Addig, who are two prominent authors within the bereavement field. So as it relates to Martin Heidegger, he has this idea, and again, this parallels with Thomas Addig, is that when we are existing in the world and someone that we love dies, and I have a strong inclination that something brought y'all here today for a reason, and I'm thinking about how there's that moment, and many of the clients that I've worked with over the years have talked about, it's like this, the moment when you find out that someone that you love has died, it's like time stops. And sorry, this makes me tearful every time I talk about it. Oof. And also, I was like, this is just a side caveat, the importance of normalizing having emotions, the importance of normalizing grieving, even as we talk about it, because there's nothing easy about losing someone that we love, or watching somebody else that we love lose someone that they love by proxy. We just want to give that caveat as well. But that as we are existing in the world and we lose someone that we love, it can tremendously impact our sense of self, our ability to feel safe, connected, grounded, and it truly alters our ability to move forward, perhaps in the same way that we did before. Part of my research is working specifically with children who have experienced grief and how they are susceptible to what Heidegger refers to as death anxiety. So thinking about, as I mentioned in some of those earlier examples, having the separation anxiety of being afraid of being disconnected from other people who may be physically present in their lives still, thinking about how there's not words to describe that feeling. It's a deep-seated sensation. It's uncomfortable. We don't have words for it. And even the words that we do have don't make sense or don't begin to encapsulate the intensity of that feeling. When we look at Heidegger's version of being towards death, this is when the moment that I was referencing earlier about the finding out when that person we love died and how, as I said, the world feels meaningless. There may be no sense of safety. There may be a sudden rush of feeling isolated, disconnected, anxious, and truly not knowing what to do. I've had clients say, like, I was standing in a store and I got a phone call. I left without my purse, without my wallet, without my phone, and I just drove. I didn't know where I went. I just let time just stopped. And in that process, we also have to find ways of learning how to exist again, because what we knew before has truly just been shattered. It doesn't make sense. We don't understand how to continue. So when we think about this idea of what relearning the world, it's like taking a broken vase and trying to put those pieces back together and get glue or Mod Podge or sometimes duct tape, whatever it takes to just try to put some of the pieces together to recreate some kind of structure or connection. When we look within the meaning-making model, and there's far more depth and breadth to these specific theories, but just a few pieces that I wanted to highlight as it directly correlates to grieving around the holidays and as it relates to substance misuse as well. How many times we have this understanding that we're grieving, we have a timeline of when it's convenient for us to be feeling it, so then we want to stop, we want to not have to deal with it anymore. I really appreciate how he separates this idea as that bereavement is something that happens to us. It is literally translate in Latin to a loss. But grief is an emotion. It's not something we can just turn on and off. And particularly when it comes to the holidays, as it relates to expectations, to traditions new and old, or suddenly trying to recreate that, can make things substantially harder and more complicated. But when in our process of relearning the world, when we can do things intentionally and learning how to be ourselves after someone that we loved who's been a stable figure in our life or not, how do we begin to process the finality of that death? How do we address those feelings of feeling helpless, feeling abandoned, feeling angry, feeling powerless that we couldn't have controlled this or done something? All those things we have to take into account. And by no means are we saying that we are finding, ultimate capital R resolutions to this, but rather what are those ways that we are learning to feel those feelings, feel our grief, which is going to be uncomfortable and not pleasant, and is unfortunately something that clients get very upset when we bring that back of, okay, there's not going to be anything comfortable about this, but the only way to be able to heal from this is to move through the emotions and the feelings. When we look at Robert Niemeyer's reconstruction model, I look at this as Niemeyer describes it as like our life existed one way when that person or people were still in our life. When they are physically no longer present, there's almost this level of dysfunction that occurs because we can't go back to what was, because that is forever changed. But trying to navigate what that means to move forward. And he's very intentional about, I know I keep coming back to things being a process or things being on a spectrum. It truly is that, because our connection to that person doesn't simply go away because they're not physically present. We carry that person with us, whether that is spiritually for religious reasons, metaphorically, quite literally, many clients of mine have created transitional objects in memory of that person to carry with them, because we're also addressing not just what we had with that person when they were alive, but we're also grieving the what would have been. And there's this need to almost restore some kind of sense of safety, some kind of sense of security, and also some kind of attachment to that person or to those people that we loved. And so part of that, and again, I'm bringing this back to the therapeutic relationship. Part of that can be accomplished because I can already hear some clients saying like, okay, Rachel, well, that's all well and good, this hypothetical thing that you're doing, but like, what does that actually mean? How do we actually do any of those things? Part of that can truly start with, like we talked about when we first meet clients, is listening, hearing the stories about the person that they loved. You would be amazed at the power of sharing your story, the impact that it has. Having somebody else hear that, bear witness to it, can make a remarkable difference. But like Nehemiah touches on as well, this is not something that is a destination that we get to. This is something that we come back and revisit, that evolves over time and is constantly revised. So an addendum to this piece, and I want to give this caveat of this is a way in which that I, in my work as an art therapist and as a mental health professional, how I've I guess formulated, for lack of a better word, or engaged with clients, with the intention of also being mindful if they have their own religious, spiritual connections to how they view death and what that looks like. Ultimately, like, full stop, that is what goes first. But when I talk about grief, kind of the combination between the three theories that I've listed so far, as well as the continuing bonds, has been the way that I've found helpful in addressing with clients. This is not a one size fits all. And this is also very much an individual decision on all of your part. But if you could just humor me in hearing this out. So some of the ways, again, that we've talked about the relationship with the deceased and what does that look like. For particularly with the tiny humans that I've worked with, this idea of losing a parent, a caregiver, a sibling, or a key member or person in their life, there's this disconnect of, this was a person that here and existed in my life, and now they are not here. There's an immense amount of cognitive dissonance of, how do I tolerate this? How do I deal with this? So we have talked about ways of there's a children's book called The Invisible String. This is based on an ancient Chinese proverb that talks about, I believe in the proverb, it is a red string. In the sake of the children's book, it's an invisible string. And it talks about this idea of continuing bonds, in that we are all, as humanity, connected by this individual string. So no matter if we are an astronaut in space, a ballerina in France, if we are Uncle Brian in heaven, we're still all interconnected. So finding ways to be able to bring the humanity piece back to grieving, to reassure clients as well as ourselves that we are not alone, that we are loved, that we are connected, and that love that we had and shared with that person or those people, again, it doesn't disappear, but rather it's another way of us finding ways to connect to that person. I think about working with clients whose mothers have passed. A mother's love never goes away. It's always there. And so what are those ways that we can, that we can find it, that we can connect to it? So thinking about, again, what are those ways that we can practice that, whether that's in the therapeutic setting? What are those ways that we can encourage people that we know and love to be able to do themselves, as a family, as a group, whatever that may be? We can use these idea of rituals. Rituals don't have to necessarily be religious based or spiritual based. It could be truly creating a memory jar. What do we put in a memory jar? We can put whatever you want in it. Ideally not substances. Sorry. What that could include may be pictures. One of the clients that you will see some artwork with later on in the presentation, at their family member's funeral, everybody passed around what looked like the equivalent of like tickets that you would get at a fair. And people wrote down from all different walks of when the client's family member was alive, people from all different time periods of that person's life wrote down memories that otherwise my client never would have known about because he wasn't alive for that. And so he has this beautiful box that we created, or memory jar that we created, that he was able to put all of those pieces into, literally hold and serve as a physical container, as a visual reminder of his special person's life. I would like to clarify as well, when I reference our special people, in my experience of working with kids, and I feel like this very much applies to adults too, sometimes there's this unspoken social hierarchy of who is worthy of being upset over that loss. So tying that back to the disenfranchised grief. So as a way to level the playing field, if you will, which again is not a one size fits all or always works, but is simply an effort on my part when engaging with kids in bereavement-based art therapy sessions. Everyone was just known as our special person. That way, if a child was had endured the loss of their parent, loss of a sibling, loss of an aunt, loss of a friend, no one loss was more important to the other. Everyone's losses were valued, were supported, and were honored in the way in which they were shared. We can go on to think about, so if creating a memory jar, like accesses, that doesn't feel like an option for some people who've lost people, who've lost loved ones through natural disasters. Maybe there's things that are not tangibly left to be able to do that. Maybe some people truly do not have photos, etc., or other things. We've talked about ways of this idea of wearing our loved ones' belongings. It doesn't have to physically be something that was the deceased person's items. Maybe it's a color that they liked. Maybe it's a fabric. Maybe it's something that you can carry with you and hold with you. Maybe it's going to places that you used to like to go, or looking at pictures of those spaces. If someone had to, for many of my kids had to, my clients had to move or relocate following a loss. So going to those places may not be feasible in that moment. We talk through what are those ways that we can modify and adjust this to meet the client's needs. So I know I've begun to talk about some of the different ideas as it relates to interventions of working with people who are grieving, or even preventative care that we can practice both ourselves and continue to practice and talk through with clients in ways that they feel would be beneficial to them. And again, I use the notion of rituals because grief is such an intense and specific thing that requires a lot of emotional energy. We can make these as personalized or as sacred as we would like it to be. So whether that is creating a physical space within our homes, at school, or if it's something as a tangible object that we carry with us, we highlight the fact that, again, intellectually, we can understand the need to express emotion, but what does it mean to actually do that? What does it mean to honor the feelings that we are having and talk through them, whether that is verbally processing, whether that is creating art, whether that is journaling, writing poetry, but we're really acknowledging the pain and the love that we had for that person. And again, just to give you an example of settings that this may occur in, this is not it has to happen in these settings, but simply just offers as examples. This could be in the individual's home. This could be in a therapeutic setting. This, again, could also serve as a transitional object, as something that a person can take with them to and from wherever they are going. We also have to consider the social connections piece. People need people. While grief is a very individual experience, we also have to consider, why do we have funerals? Why do we invite people to come over to our houses to share food, to share memories, to interact with one another? Because we are social people and we need that support. So whether that is direct conversations, whether that is sitting side by side and just knowing that you're there together. For many of the kids that I worked with, the consistent feedback that I received over the decade plus was, I didn't know that somebody else felt like that. I didn't know I wasn't alone. I think about how that even applies to parents, how that applies to spouses. When other half is no longer there, when our parent is no longer there, when our child is no longer there. It is an incredibly isolating experience at times, which is all the more reason we need that kind of support. That may look like bereavement support groups. I've listed 3 different examples that exist in Columbus. I'm sure there's a plethora more. If you know of more, please feel free to drop that in the chat. I'm a huge proponent of can we give resources, can we give support? So being able to share that connection with one another is essential. Individual therapy, which I want to be mindful of, access to services is not always feasible for families or for individuals. I put All Holistic Consultation, which is the organization that I'm in private practice with. Also, Chiron Art Therapy is a wonderful organization that specializes with grief and working with people who've experienced grief in art therapy. There are other versions of intentional, self-identified self-care. That could be and again, this can take place in any type of setting or circumstance. I always tell clients, it's what do you need that to look like for you? So because grief is such a physical experience, I strongly encourage clients to look into what are ways that you can move your body that feels helpful and intentional to help release some of those somatic symptoms that you're experiencing. For some people, it's doing yoga with Adrienne on YouTube. For others, it's the need to physically get out of the house and go to a space, weather dependent, because we know Ohio is a hot mess depending on the day of what's going on. That may look like doing something in the parks, and maybe going to, the student discounted yoga studios or doing yoga for trade. It may be doing some kind of guided meditation or audiobook. It may maybe this doesn't feel like those are accessible resources. Can we talk about the notion of art making, ways of releasing our emotions that we've internalized that there are not words for, and putting it onto paper, putting it into found objects, creating a sculpture? For those of you who are like, I'm not artistic, this doesn't make sense, this isn't helpful. When we think about, again, what does it mean to express ourselves? This doesn't have to be about the destination, a final product. This is simply being able to sit in our emotions, express them in a way that is helpful and constructive, in that we're not blocking or eliminating or shaming the emotions, but rather we're finding ways to be able to support ourselves and support others around us. And for many of you, and I can attest myself, when we're experiencing grief, sometimes there's not words for it. So having those alternative outlets as ways to be able to release those emotions can be tremendously helpful. When we think about critical engagement, what I mean to consider, and this is more of almost like a bird's eye view perspective. Again, when we talk about losing someone that we love, I know I mentioned this earlier, and I'm going to keep highlighting this phrase home. This idea that loss does not exist in a vacuum. We have to consider the bigger picture. What is this individual's perspective on where they are socially, politically, economic factors? How are these all contributing to our ability to experience our grief that is an emotion? Sometimes we don't have the option or the luxury of having even more than 24 hours to begin even feeling our feelings, because we're taking care of other people, because we're caring for our children, because we're working 2 jobs, because we're doing all these other pieces that are taking away our attention, our time. This ties back to the holidays. How many of us are constantly overscheduled, overspending, underpaid, trying to make all these things happen for other people in our life to maintain not even the status quo or keeping up with the Joneses, just trying to create some sense of connection, especially after a loss, which is already that much more harder, because there's no amount of things that could make up for that love, for that loss, for that person not being there. And that can get really hard to not want to engage with substances of any kind, as a means to be able to numb that or dull that out. And it's very easy for me as the clinician to sit here and say, well, don't use those things. Well, um, that's very easy to say, but in practice it's much more difficult to do. So tying that into understanding our own grief experiences and our clients' grief experiences as clinicians, we do not judge what other people are doing or need to do to try to get through this. Our intention is to be there with curiosity, with support, with kindness, because how much of that, thinking about tying that back to the disenfranchised grief, if I have someone I love that died through as a result, let's say, of suicide or died from, a drug or alcohol overdose, there's an innate lack of social acceptance for that. I'm going to be, as a mom, I fear, would I be judged for what happened to my child? Would I be considered that I did not do right by them, or should I have done more? And that fear, if other people knew that, what would that say about me? What would that say about my family? How would that change how people would talk to me? We will go into further later what it looks like to create those intentional time and space for ourselves when we are grieving around the holidays, and how we can be intentional about how we are treating ourselves during that time. Other ways, again, as it relates to engaging in the therapeutic process, if again, verbally processing may not be the way to go for some clients, or there may be even just some strong resistance of even touching that grief, having them tell their stories through images, through photos, through collages, through found objects. Those are all beautiful ways of finding the ability to process your grief as an emotion. Oh, okay. So when we begin to look, actually, let me pause before I continue to the next section. Are there any existing pressing questions, thoughts, experiences, or anything that anyone wants to share? I realize I've been talking for a very long time and just wanted to open that door for anyone who wanted to share.
Just love to point out the chat has there are a lot of wonderful resources that people are putting in there. So if people haven't looked through the chat, please do. There's a lot of interaction in there. So check it out if you have not.
And thank you, everyone who has participated in adding resources to this and supporting one another. I think this is such a beautiful example of how, when we are able to share parts of our journeys with one another, being able to create that connection, that support is such an incredible thing. So thank you all for participating in that and utilizing that resource. Things to consider when we are addressing the holidays. We're looking at, again, that bird's eye view perspective of this normalized idea of overindulgence. We are going to have excess amounts of sugar, sometimes alcohol, sometimes drugs, sometimes food. Whatever that may be, it's the holidays. I'll wait till the new year, then I'll start my dry January, or then I'll start my exercise journey, or whatever that may be, or change these habits that I have not modified in years, but suddenly, because it's New Year's Day, I'm going to change all these things. There may be family traditions that strongly encourage the use of substances that may or may not serve you very well, particularly when you are grieving. There's also an immense amount of pressure and anxiety, not to mention depression too, that goes into socializing far more than perhaps you have in the past or at any other time during the year, interacting with people, maybe extended family members, or that family member that no one gets along with because we all know why, but nobody talks about it. That is innately stressful. The ongoing family dynamics, not to mention the traveling, the finances that go into all of these things, the gatherings, the gifts, the unspoken expectations from everybody else of how, when, where to be. And that's not even to mention social media and feeling the pressure to have coordinated pajamas, family photos, Christmas cards. I know I'm barely scratching the surface, but you take any of those ideas, that comparative thinking of how my family looks to somebody else, those unrealistic expectations that are put on to someone, regardless if they're grieving. But you add a loss or losses on top of that, and that may tip the scale. That may be just be too I truly believe it's already too much just in and of itself, but you add grief on top of that. And it is a snowball effect that just perpetually gets harder and harder and harder, which I think in many cases, when we're not intentional about our time and how we are spending the holidays, that can very easily lead us down that snowball into the substance misuse that can also even perpetuate further into other mental health related issues. There's also a component too, when we think about, again, that spectrum of, I want to keep up with the expectations, the comparative thinking, make it look like I have it together, even though inside I'm falling apart. That can also perpetuate those feelings of isolation and disconnect, even when we're showing up, but we're not there. We are not emotionally there, or we may be physically present, but not emotionally present, and how that can have substantial impacts on our sense of self, our connection. And it can certainly, when remember earlier when we talked about those boxes of grief that we shoved in the storage unit, that storage unit is going to start busting at the seams. And that's where things can get really complicated really quickly. So in looking at, because I've had clients also ask, like, Rachel, does this mean I have a substance abuse problem? If I'm prescribed this medication from my doctor, and if I didn't take it, but I need it, when do I need to get off these meds? When do I haven't been able to sleep because my partner died, but I should, it's been 2 weeks. I should absolutely get off of them. Public service announcement. That is a conversation as therapists for most of us. I cannot, this is not a one size fits all. As mental health clinicians, we are not, as far as I'm concerned, given the capacity to prescribe medication. 10 out of 10 recommend, please speak to your medical professional who prescribed you this medication to make decisions about your medication. One thing I will strongly encourage clients that I think is within the bounds is making sure, if you're directions for your medication say do not drink with alcohol or use with other substances, please do not do that. Intellectually, we can understand this all day, but when we're grieving, when we are hurting, when we are struggling, we may forget. We may think, oh, it won't be that bad, or oh, it won't hurt. You've already had enough loss as it is. We don't need to continue to add to that. This is where that notion of experimentation can come into play. Oh, it's the holidays. We can just have fun. It's okay. It's okay if I mix these things. It's probably not. Maybe there's not social or legal consequences to begin with, but the outcome of that fine line between experimenting to regular use, it's a sway of the wind. Again, this is not intended as any kind of like shaming or harming of or judgment towards somebody else, because it sounds like ultimately you're seeking comfort, you're seeking peace, you're seeking relief from the intensity of this grief. I can assure you that mixing Chardonnay with your antidepressant is not going to go well, and you're going to feel worse than you did before. It may be very easy for me to sit here and tell you that, but what can we do to help modify this plan that you have that already feels unbearable as it relates to the holidays? What are some safety parameters that we can put in place to help you to feel okay? Maybe not great, maybe not phenomenal, because it's the first Christmas without your son. So of course it's going to suck. And being honest as clinicians with them about that, there's nothing fun or enjoyable for the most part about grief, but there's also gratitude that does come with it too. That's later. We don't have to worry about that right now. So just being able to give you a visual of what that begins to look like as clinicians or people on the outside looking in. So when we're thinking about, well, again, we can have fun, this is just socially acceptable. We may be using because we had a really hard day. Traffic was terrible. The Amazon packages got stolen. We had to reorder this or rebook this flight to be able to hopefully get this person home. Can we go back to those other ways or rituals that we find of relieving stress? Because again, that shift from experimentation to regular use can become really complicated. Regular use may include using substances or alcohol regularly that doesn't necessarily have a dependence or an addiction yet, because you can still quit on your own accord. But we also have to be mindful, especially those of us who are around, well, no, I won't couple that to just being around kids. We also have to be mindful of when we have tiny humans or other people around us, They're looking at us for how we are grieving and how we're managing our grief. Can we practice talking about our emotions and sharing them and giving other people around us, modeling those skills that may be helpful for them, that could then in turn build connection, that can then in turn support, just like y'all are doing here in this group chat, sharing those resources, sharing with openness, with compassion, with kindness. How can we not only show that to other people in our life, but show that to ourselves? And again, I won't go into grand detail with risky use and abuse and drug addiction dependency, but the highlights from that essentially are when we're going to start using those previously, like, oh, I'm taking a sleep medication, I'm gonna, chase that with some Chardonnay. When I start looking at more risky use, I'm doing that regularly now. I'm past regular. This is now leading to a more serious problem that if I don't use those two things together, now it's no longer getting the trick. And now I'm having to use more than my prescribed amount, or I'm using more alcohol than I should be using at all, given with medication that says do not use this. Drug addiction and dependency, it's when the use of the substances cross the blood-brain barrier and I absolutely have to use that, and it is completely impacting my relationships, my physical and mental health, my finances, my job security. I would honestly argue and say that all those pieces are already impacted from experimentation at the start. They're just happening perhaps in more isolated, smaller incidents. But just like the storage unit of the boxes, the more we ignore the feelings and the grief, you couple that with the substances, our ability to regulate and process our emotions are going to be substantially more challenging because those grief feelings are just going to grow bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger until something gives. And it's not fun when that happens. So what do we do with that? How do we combat not just processing our grief during the holidays, but also how do we combat the socialized norm of substance misuse during the holidays? We can limit triggers. What does that look like? Because for some of us, we are going to be around those people that trigger us, but we can come up with ideas related to, am I setting a time limit for the amount of time I have to be around this person that's triggering? Do I have a list of safe people that I can call or contact if I'm triggered and find myself wanting to overindulge or want to do things that may be outside of what would keep me safe in this moment? I can set boundaries as it relates to myself of, I'm not saying I need to remain abstinent, but perhaps for me, if I have more than one glass of wine, I know that's going to send me into a depressive spiral. I know the next couple of days I'm not going to come out of that hole. And I'm being very cautious of, we're not setting ourselves up to fail in that we are setting hard, fast parameters, but really considering what is the impact of my actions and how is that going to affect not just current me, but future me as well? Being intentional about the invitations that you accept. Is this a space where if I am suddenly overcome with emotions because I'm thinking about, oh, we are now at the 1 year mark from when my cousin died by suicide. Do I want to be around those people? Is that a safe place for me to be if I need to excuse myself, if I need to cry, if I'm going to have a panic attack? Do I feel okay to be there? If in the instance that the answer to any of those questions is no, we need a plan. Who's somebody that I can call that can come get me? Is there a way for me to get out of this situation into a safe place or a safe location or with a safe person? What are those preventative measures if I know today's going to be that day where we're seeing my partner's family coming in from out of town? There's going to be no time for me to do anything but slap on a face and pretend that everything's great. Where am I building in time to take care of myself? It doesn't matter if it's 5 minutes to 3 hours, 2 minutes, whatever you need to be able to help yourself regulate, not just in that day, but what are we looking at the day after or that night? What are those ways that you can help yourself to recharge? Other things that clients have talked about as well, we always had the tradition that my dad cut down the tree. He's not here anymore. What if I don't want to be in the same, I don't want to be in my house. I don't want to be in the same space. We talk about this idea of trying something new. What would it look like if you got a used Christmas tree? And by that, I mean, I mean a fake Christmas tree instead of cutting down a real tree. Or what would that look like instead of, on Christmas Eve, you prepared this specific type of meal? What if y'all created a different menu to do together as a family? What if finances are an option? What if you order takeout? Whatever that may be, it can be as subtle and as simple, or can be as elaborate as you want it to be. It's what is the need that you have? What is the need of your family? Um, Other ways, again, connecting with your support system. So whether that's connecting with your family, if that's connecting with some of the support groups, that's connecting with other people who you know have experienced a loss like this, connecting with pastors, priests, religious connections, spiritual connections, whatever that may be, trying to find the balance between taking time for yourself and not self-isolating, finding ways to address your emotional needs without relying on or turning towards first to substances to numb, to modify yourself, and being intentional about, if I'm going to enjoy this toast, let me do so with the intention in mind of this is for this person for this reason in this way. And again, this next section is just looking at coping with grief during the holidays, and particularly in the therapeutic setting, looking at realistic, I should underline that, or insert that and underline it, realistic goals with clients, as well as creating this notion of new traditions. And what that looks like, again, is particularly when we are grieving, what we may have the emotional energy to do perhaps in the past is going to look vastly different. We are grieving now. Again, finding that balance between planned activities without isolating yourself. And I really cannot emphasize this third one enough. Allow yourself to feel all of your feelings. How often, when we are in the holidays and we have reserved this small box of emotions for us to be able to give ourselves permission to feel, because it's not socially acceptable, because it's not proper etiquette, or whatever that may be. Grief is an emotion, and you deserve to be able to experience that emotion to the fullest extent that you need in order to heal, in order to process that. It is completely reasonable if you don't want to do it in front of everyone. That's okay. But finding ways, when we are practicing that self-talk, feelings are not good or bad or negative or positive. It's our body's way of trying to tell us something. When we experience grief or sadness or disappointment, those are not good or bad things. They're simply giving us a cue into what's going on in our own internal experience. It's also okay to draw on other people for comfort instead of slamming back that Red Bull and Coke or whatever your drink of choice may be. It's okay to turn to say to someone, say, like, I'm having a really hard time. I really miss my son. I wish he was here. And I can guarantee you, most of the time, having that validation, having that eye contact, that support, I hear you, I see you. And also preventatively working with clients of words that can help and words that can hurt. There was a card that I used to give out to clients, teachers, and parents and caregivers, because how often other people want to help but simply don't know how to. Part of that starts in the therapeutic relationship. We help clients to navigate what their needs are, putting that into words, and helping them to have the courage to ask for that support from other people. Again, so we're not relying on substances and misuse to just get through it. What if we build something meaningful in reconnecting with the people that we love that are still here? And I want to emphasize that may not always be possible in terms of this grand expectation. One of the trauma therapists I follow had a joke about the upcoming holidays of, no, we're not going to expect that your emotionally unavailable people in your life are suddenly going to change because it's the holidays. So again, we are adapting those expectations to who are identified safe people, what are key phrases or things that we may need to hear, and how are we practicing giving that to ourselves and letting other safe people know what that may be. So just some other examples of what that can look like with even creating new traditions. These do not need to be elaborate, over the top things. This may be something as subtle as lighting a candle in honor of your loved one. You don't have to announce that to the room or to anybody else there. That can be just for you. Having a moment of silence before a holiday meal. I put dinner in because that's the first thing that came to mind. It could be placing a commemorative ornament in honor of your loved one. It could be something that you all do together as a family. It could be holding perhaps their stocking. It could be sharing a poem, writing a poem, playing their favorite music while you're decorating the tree, if that's something that you do. Playing your loved one or loved one's special favorite game. It could be incorporating some of their favorite food, favorite meal. One of the things that Thomas Addig talks about as well is that, again, just because our loved one is not physically present, it doesn't mean that they don't live on through our memories, through our traditions. It doesn't mean that we have to stop talking about them as if they never existed. What a beautiful way to honor them with gratitude and sharing memories of things that they used to do or used to say, or things they used to make. My grandfather, for as long as I can remember, since I was tiny, would always make corn on the cob. I think it's just like a Midwest thing. We just love corn. And anytime we would have it, he would have this little I don't even know what they're called, but you stick it into the side so you don't burn your fingers, because as little kids, we just wanted to pick it up and eat it, and then we'd cry because our hands were burnt. This isn't real. My point being, there's other ways of, whether that's something as simple as telling that subtle story, whether that is having corn at meals, which in the Midwest is apparently all the time, but whatever that is, doing so and doing it with intention and thoughtfulness. Sometimes it may bring tears. Other times it may make you laugh. Other times it may make somebody else laugh, but it's another opportunity for connection and closeness. We don't have to fear what that may look like in turning towards one another. We can use that as an opportunity to let the grief come out, let ourselves feel that sense of connection, sense of safety, sense of trust. I'd also like to share with you just some case examples of using art therapy with clients who have experienced grief. I'd like to give this caveat to you before I go through these case examples. As non-art therapists, yes, you can absolutely use art. You can do these different ideas yourselves. I would strongly encourage you, if you are clinicians wanting to understand more about art therapy, please connect with me, and I would love to go into a more in-depth explanation between the difference between using art for therapy purposes versus using art as art therapy, because they're two completely separate entities, and I'll come back to that intentionality behind it. But that's not to say that as art therapists, we have some kind of like hold on art. But just like as a psychiatrist can prescribe medication, I, as a mental health therapist, can tell you firsthand from watching clients be on different medications, seeing how it can change their life. I could tell you how it's working, but because I don't have the training and the skills to prescribe medication or understanding how that impacts the brain or how that's measured, I stay within my scope of practice, making sure I'm not stepping out of that. But that doesn't mean that I can't be encouraging and being clear about what can be helpful for somebody else. So I just give that caveat. This was an example that I did with one of my tiny humans, who was an 8-year-old female identifying child who experienced the death of her brother, who was murdered 3 blocks away from her house. And so what we spent a lot of time focusing on, particularly as it related to the upcoming holidays, was this idea of how she felt on the inside and how she felt on the outside. Meaning, what did everybody else in the world see, and how different that looked from how she was actually feeling and trying to process her grief. For this client in particular, she described feeling a lot of validation in being able to use art as a way to express her emotions. meaning that by simply being able to engage with the art materials, like using chalk pastels and moving that motion, it was a way to be able to release her internalized anxiety, to release her internalized anger, which she named during this process. Um, for her, there was this, she described, and this is a client I worked with for 3 years, and she talked a lot about how feeling like she had to be the perfect daughter, even at the age of 8. I can see my mom's in pain. I see that my other siblings are in pain. And if I just do school really, if I do really well in school, and if I just stay like neat and put together, then somehow that's going to control everything. That's going to make everything okay, because I couldn't control what happened to my brother. I can't go back to that park. I can't walk past it anymore. I have to go a different walking route to school. It's too painful. My mom does not talk about my brother. You know, Miss Rachel, I want to be able to share stories about him, to talk about the things that we used to do. We used to love to go to that park, and we use that opportunity both to explore what the outside of her mask looked like, and then on the inside, how she truly felt inside and wanting to have the space to be able to talk about her brother. And so within the group setting, she was able to share that and begin to be able to know, to cultivate what she described as like an ongoing relationship with him, not in a like pretending that he's still alive, but she described it as, well, he's always watching over me. He's making sure that I get to school safe. He will always be my big brother. I think that's so valuable. And had we just been using verbal communication as a way to process it, I'm not sure we would have gotten there. And how meaningful it was for her as well as the other group members to have that space together. Because and I can tell you firsthand, this still is a vivid memory in my mind of, we spent a session talking about our special people. All participants were offered the opportunity to share, but were never ever forced to share, ever. I still remember once this client shared about her brother, it was like a ripple effect. Then the next student had said, oh, well, my dad was shot. And then somebody else said, oh, well, my uncle was shot. And then the fourth child said, well, my dad just died in a motorcycle accident. And I say that example not for shock value, because it is horrifying. But the point is that even in children, not even understanding that not only is this an experience that other children that they saw each and every day had, but again, going back to that hierarchy, this idea of, if my loss wasn't the most intense, or wasn't in this kind of way, that somehow it was less than, or if it wasn't my dad and it was somebody else, and somehow that is less than. And so we use that again as a wonderful opportunity to clarify, your person matters. Each of your people matter, and their stories matter. And this is a safe space for you to be able to talk about that if and when you want to. But you just being here, that's already more than enough. This led us into, this was another client of mine that introduced her special person. And again, as I talked about in the top of the presentation, we use special people again to try to eliminate the hierarchy of loss, of somehow some being more difficult than others. This is somebody you loved, that's already enough. And so this client created what is poorly displayed here, but if you actually see the piece in person, it almost looks like a shadow box. And what this client did was created an artwork dedicated to her brother. And what she did was, on the insides of, let me see if my cursor will work, insides of the box here were little notes where she put memories of her brother's favorite sayings and thoughts and nicknames, as a way to be able to remember and to hold on to that. And for this client, religion was a really important piece for her. So she saw her brother as in the hands of God, that God was protecting him, and that he was okay, and he was no longer in any pain. And again, I can't emphasize enough the power of being able to watch clients translate their experiences into artwork, and having that as a literal visual representation of their grief experiences, just remarkably powerful. This piece was created by an adolescent that I was working with related to a grief box. What was fascinating with this was the client talked about wanting to have a box within a box. That both as a literal metaphor of it's a box in a box, and metaphorically speaking, as a way to be intentional about who was allowed to know about his grief. And what I mean to say by that is we talked a lot about how the person that you love is a sacred and beautiful thing that deserves to be cherished and respected. And that just because we experience a loss does not mean that we owe that entire explanation to anyone or everyone. Um, I'm sure some of you can relate to that idea of having perhaps a person not in the immediate circle or second or third, maybe fourth or fifth circle who knew your parent, knew your spouse, but didn't know that they had passed. And so being intentional about what information or details need to be shared, if at all, and finding that balance of being mindful of our energy and our time. Because how many times did you have to then comfort that distant person? Or how many times did you not have the energy to have that conversation to explain it one more time to somebody else, or to be afraid or worried about that judgment or what that would look like? So for this client, the box inside of the box was where he placed all of his key important memories to him that he had handwritten out because he didn't want to forget them. And for this client would have been 12 years old at the time. He created that inside box with his grandmother's necklace on the outside to be able to give to his nieces and nephews when they were old enough so then they could remember who their grandma was. And I say this is just, there's no limit to what these need to look like. You can call them a grief box, you can call them a memory jar, whatever the medium is that you want to use, all of those are valuable and important and are truly an extension of love and appreciation and gratitude for the person that you're remembering. What a beautiful way to honor them. And again, there's an intense amount of emotions and depth that go into that, and it is exhausting. But again, I invite you to consider these alternative options or things to begin to work on. This client in particular worked on this piece for 6 weeks. So this is not again, I go back to what Nehemiah and Attic talked about. We are constantly revisiting this notion of learning to physically live without the person or people that we loved. We're revisiting this notion of death. It's not something that's just going to go away or suddenly heal itself, but rather we have to be mindful and intentional about giving ourselves space to process that, being mindful of how are we spending our time, and particularly around the holidays, how are we adjusting that time in order to preserve our energy and the integrity of our interactions with others. I think there's one more example. Yes. This example was Draw an Angel. I can't tell you how many clients again have said, I'm not an artist. I don't understand what I'm doing. You want me to draw I can't draw an angel. And for this particular client, it was fascinating because her angel took on the form of more of an abstract drawing. And something she had talked about was, and again, I think this also ties back to disenfranchised loss. How many moms have lost a child? And whether that child died before in utero, or stillborn, or died shortly after their birth, how frequently those are not acknowledged or addressed, let alone talked about. And she described this as her son's soul. And it was fascinating because in this group, she had never ever considered that an actual loss or even gave herself the validation that that was a child and that she was a mom. And again, so using the art as a way to be able to create connection, to practice that active empathy, to take those storage boxes that have been packed away for a very long time that have been growing and growing and growing. Because until we release the grief, until we experience the emotion, it doesn't just magically leave. I don't know how many Pixar fans we have out there, or anybody who've seen Inside Out 1 or 2. The feelings have to go somewhere. And why not release them in a way that can feel authentic and true and not be exiled or smushed down or ignored or shoved to the back of the brain? But can we find those ways to be able to help support not only ourselves, but those around us in modeling what it means to be safe people, a willingness to listen, a willingness to bear witness to those stories, to honor those experiences with that person or those people, and what a tremendous difference that act of kindness can go. So I would like to use this time now to open up questions, experiences, if other people have more specific cases or anything that may be, I'd like to open the floor as that option.
I would just like to say that I'm just absolutely overwhelmed in how amazing this webinar was. I've gone to so many. I've gone to conferences. I've even heard Kendoka, and I think yours, I learned more than anything I have been in. And I'm emotional just sharing this with you, but I love how you were shared your emotions with us. That really touched me because it was so professional, and yet your empathy was beautiful.
Ellen, I'm truly moved. I can't see your face because I'm sharing a screen, so I feel weird staring at my computer, but just thank you so much for your gracious words. That means more to me than I'm literally speechless right now. So just thank you.
I'm glad it's recorded because I want to listen to the whole thing again. There was so much to take in.
Thank you so much. And I'm hopeful of being able to work that, and promise I'm not trying to plug myself, but if there are other opportunities for connection, whether through GAP webinars, through other connections, professional connections or what have you, please, I want to encourage this to everyone who's attended the webinar. If you have further questions or follow-up, I would also love to hear from you as well. Collaborating is truly one of my favorite things to do. So any way that I can help, I would love to.
If there's no other like questions or discussion, Rachel and I will be staying on for just a few extra minutes if anyone really needs some support. We'll be here. Before we hang up, I just want to send our newsletter, Survey Monkey, as well as our evaluation. So that's how you will get your CVs today. We thank you all so much for being here. I know that sometimes these webinars can have like a lot of heavy content, but it's been really amazing to see everyone support each other in the chat and have such a wonderful discussion. Thank you so much to Rachel. Thank you everyone for, I think I've seen like, I don't know, 50, 100 likes, and just like everyone like loving everyone's messages and connecting to the chat. And after this, I will send a follow-up email, hopefully by the end of this week, at the beginning of next week, with all the resources listed in the chat, the recording of this, and you'll have my direct email. So if you would like to connect or learn anything about the GAP network, get connected with Rachel, I will send all that information out, and I will also put my email in the chat right now. So if you need anything, if you have any questions about the Gap Network, please reach out to me. We're so happy to have any participation. On December 10th, we will be having our a virtual remembrance ceremony. And I will also send registration out in that follow-up email that I mentioned earlier. So please keep an eye out for that. And again, thank you all so much for being here. I know grief and loss can be a very hard subject to talk about, so we appreciate you so much being here and having an open and honest conversation, and hopefully learning something in the process. So, like I said, Rachel and I will stay on for just a few minutes in case anyone needs anything. But please feel free to take some time for yourself, and please take care of yourselves today as well as throughout the holidays. So, thank you all so much for being here. We appreciate it.
Thank you.